Hello and welcome everybody. It's so nice to see you joining us from all over Australia and possibly even beyond. Hello and welcome. It's wonderful to see you for this ACEN webinar. If you haven't joined us in a while, then we are so happy to see you back. If this is your first time joining us for an ACEN online event, well then please feel free, very welcome in this space. My name is Dr. Bonnie Dean. I'm from the University of Wollongong and I'm the chair of the New South Wales ACT chapter for ACEN. It's my privilege to host this ACEN webinar today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge country, and I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and the many lands that we are currently residing on. I'd like to recognise the continuing connection to lands, waters and communities, and pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, to the elders past, present and emerging. Well, today we have you for an online webinar. We've got you for approximately 60 minutes. So that will take us on Australian Eastern Standard Time to 1:30. And if you're in other parts of Australia, you can set your clocks at 60 minutes from this moment. We're going to start with a presentation from our President of ACEN, Professor Denise Jackson, and then after that we're going to have some question and answer time. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. I would get you to please put your videos off and also place yourself on mute throughout the presentation. That will help us with the recording and that will also help us ensure that we stay focused on our presenter and the content today. This webinar will be recorded and the recording will be placed on the ACEN website. So if there's something that you missed, or for instance, if you weren't able to make it today, then please come along and watch it on the ACEN website at your leisure. Okay, well, I think that's it for me. And now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our presenter today. Professor Denise Jackson is the president of ACEN and is a director of WIL at the School of Business at Edith Cowan University. Denise is the GOS lead for ACEN. Denise is the mastermind behind the WIL items in the GOS survey. And it's my pleasure to introduce you and hand you over now to Denise to reflect on the past 3 years of data of student participation in WIL. Over to you, Denise.
Great, thanks, Bonnie, as always, for a lovely introduction. Hi, everyone. I was going to say morning, but it's afternoon for many of you. So just to give an overview of what this GOS webinar is about, if you've attended one previously, you'll kind of know the drill. A bit of a background on the GOS items, which we don't need to discuss in too much detail. Those are the areas that we're looking at today. So as Bonnie mentioned, this is a review of 3 years worth of data from the GOS and looking at student participation in WIL rather than impact, which will be a later webinar, that's next month. So we're looking at those 5 different areas and then discussing some of the stakeholder implications. What I've tried to do to make it kind of digestible is go through 1 or 2 sections and then look at the kind of key takeaways before we move on to the next part. So in terms of the ACEN GOS items, these were introduced 3 years ago. Actually, we're in our 4th year of data collection now. So today you'll be looking at data from the 2020, 2021 and 2022 GOS surveys. As we're talking about participation in WIL, the data does include international students, whereas when we look at impact, we tend to look only at domestic graduates. So just to flag that here now. You've got your 3 different times of collection there, and you can see the number of universities that participated in the GOS. I'm sure you're all familiar with the GOS. If you're not, then it's where we gather data about student satisfaction on the course that they undertook, and also they report on their labour force outcomes, and that's done around 4 to 6 months post-course completion. It's administered by the Social Research Centre, so they've been very supportive in including these items. And the 5 items which are included in the GOS are available free for our members. And as you can see, a high proportion of our members are opting in, and that's leading to our large sample sizes, which you can see in that bottom bullet point there. So the 5 items are here, which you'll be, familiar with if you've been to one of these webinars before, if you've looked at the data. We're concentrating today on the blue areas, which is participation in different forms of WIL. And we categorize WIL into that which is work-based, so internships, placements, practicum, professional practice, etc. WIL that's not based in the workplace, or for brevity, non-workplace WIL. So that's your projects, consulting, incubators, that type of thing. And then we have global WIL experiences. And it doesn't matter whether it's core or elective, although I have actually divided that down, you'll see in the presentation. But that's the participation in WIL, that's the item around that. And then you can see the third item relates to participation in co or extracurricular employability-related activities. And we focus on those different examples: volunteering, position of responsibility, etc. So the first half of the first part of the presentation is around WIL, and then we move in a bit later to what we call the ERAs, which is the employability-related activities. And as I mentioned, the impact of the different types of WIL will be looked at in the June webinar. So moving forward, so the first area is student participation by type of WIL and course level. Now, I've largely presented the data in charts this time to kind of make it hopefully a bit more digestible. So just to go through, this one is undergraduate level only, and the following 2 slides will look at postgraduate or coursework postgraduates and postgraduates doing research courses. But this one, so this is related to all of those students who completed a bachelor course. And you've got the blue bars are for 2020, orange for 2021, and then you've got the grey bar for 2022. You've got the different types of WIL that you can see there. So just focusing on the work-based, you can see that there's been a dip for work-based WIL in 2021. Remembering the lag, the 2021 data is reporting for graduates that completed 6 months earlier or completed their course 6 months earlier. It could be that slight drop is possibly due to COVID restrictions, perhaps. And that drop is actually fairly consistent, you'll see in the coming slides. So a bit of a drop and then growth. And for some, you'll see the growth has actually taken us to above the 2020 data. To be honest, I was hoping to see a bit of a larger growth there, but that's where we're sitting at. If we move to non-workplace WIL, you can see that that's grown by around 5 percentage points over the 3-year period, which is great. So that focus that we've had on more innovative or different forms of WIL beyond that WIL which takes place in the workplace are consistently growing over time. Global WIL, in contrast, has fallen. And now, again, that might be skew from COVID, obviously less travel. So we can monitor that over the coming years and see if that changes at all. And then if you look on the far right-hand side, that's students, undergraduates that didn't participate in WIL at all. So you can, and just to clarify, students can report, or graduates can report, that they participate in more than one type of WIL. So these things do not add up to 100%. They might do work-based WIL and global WIL, and so on and so on. But on the right, you've got those graduates reported that they didn't do any type of WIL at all. Now, that is falling, but again, it's still fairly high. If you think, it's around 40% of undergraduates are still not taking part in WIL, and that's the cohort that reported in 2022, which is perhaps, we're obviously looking to get that figure down in years to come. So looking at postgraduate coursework participation. So again, looking at work-based WIL, you can see that slight dip in 2021 and then rising. So actually the 2022 figure is higher, proportionally as a proportion compared to bachelor students. Postgrad courseworks are participating less in work-based WIL, which is probably what we would have expected when we think about our own courses, probably. But there is that growth is there between 20 and 22, which is good. But again, we're hopeful that will increase further over the years. Non-workplace will, again, same as for undergrads, we're seeing a growth there in about 5 percentage points over the 3-year period, which is great. And again, we're seeing that same trend in global will falling. Again, that might be related to the lack of international travel. In terms of postgraduates that are not doing will at all, you can see that that's falling. But again, it's still fairly high, around it's around 50-50 for our postgrads completing will and not completing will. So again, hopefully that might go down over the when we look at the data for this year and going forward. Postgraduate research is a bit of a good news story, and we kind of think that this is probably an area for growth going forward, given the focus on the change in funding around HDR internships and the fact that this is featuring probably in many institutions NPIL measures as well. So looking at work-based will first, you can see there's been a growth there from 8% consistently over the 3-year period. So no dip there for those students during that time in 2021, unlike the coursework graduates. Non-workplace will has also grown, although proportionately less than the coursework graduates. And global will, again, we're not seeing that trend of falling. We're seeing a small, albeit a small, increase over the years. And, aligned to this, as we would expect, we're seeing a fall in the proportion of HDR graduates that are reporting back that they didn't complete will on the far right-hand side. That's a fairly good fall. But again, those figures are, over 75% of our HDR graduates are not participating in will during their course. But we're on the right trajectory, which is great. So moving on, what I've done here is actually thought I'd focus on elective disciplines where work-based will has traditionally been elective. So there was a bit of guesswork here. So I'll show you the disciplines. These are the different discipline areas that I've considered are most likely to involve elective work-based will. And you can see the numbers of undergraduates there. Now, on the right-hand side, you've got the count. That is the count of undergraduates over the 3 years in that discipline area. And then the percentage is the proportion of that count that have got the proportion from, they will total up to 100, basically, from that particular area. So you've got science and mathematics, computing and info systems as we work our way down the list. Just noting before we move to a graph on their participation in work-based will, you've got tourism and hospitality, which is low numbers, just to flag that up front. The areas that I actually excluded from this analysis, making an assumption that essentially they are likely to have mandatory will in them, was engineering, health services and support, medicine, nursing, pharmacy, dentistry, vet science, rehabilitation, teacher education and social work. Now, because there's been a drive in incorporating will into the curriculum, it might be that some of these areas also have mandatory will in them. So there could be some skew in the data, but remembering that we're only talking about work-based will here, so internships, placements, etc. We're not talking about will more generally. So those are the disciplines. Now, I'm going to present this in a slide, in a chart in a moment, but I just wanted to give you a snapshot first of all. So you can see you've got your 3 different years. You can see you've got a base count there. So, for example, 6,354 undergraduates were from science and mathematics in that 2020, or we gather data from those undergraduates in 2020. And 15.5, that they represent 15.5% of the total sample. So you can see of the elective sample. So you can see that business and management is quite a big proportion here of what we're looking at. So these are the students, the proportion that participated in work-based will in that particular discipline area. Sorry if I was confusing there for a moment. So I'm going to actually move to a graph. It's a bit easier to talk through. So this is the percentage of all of those students in that particular discipline that participated in work-based WIL. So looking at it straight away, you can see that the greatest proportion is from business and management. So essentially what we're saying there is that of all of those elective disciplines, business and management seem to be the ones, and this is national data, that seem to be offering work-based WIL, possibly more than those other discipline areas. That's followed by science and mathematics, and then you've got the humanities, culture and social sciences area. Those are probably, that's 1, 2, 3. And the rest are, fairly similar. They're ranging really from around the kind of 5 or just under 5 to 10% mark of those students that are participating in work-based WIL. Tourism, hospitality, very low proportion there, which kind of surprised me because I'm thinking, okay, a lot of hospitality and hotel management students go out on placement, but then, as I flagged earlier, there's low figures there, so that could be potentially why. In terms of the trends within those different disciplines, you can see for business and management that it's falling over the years, which is, not particularly, positive. We might have expected to see that dip in 2021, which we saw earlier, but that dip hasn't recovered in 2022. So those figures are actually going down for that particular discipline. Science and mathematics, we've got a bit more stability and slight growth there. And you can see if you're whichever particular discipline area you're most interested in, you can see that there's some growth in some and some are fairly static over time. But that gives you a bit of an idea of the proportion of students in that discipline area, undergraduates that are participating in work-based WIL, which, is perhaps not as positive as we'd hoped for some discipline areas, and also how that changes over time. And I guess, we know there's been a big drive for including WIL in these different discipline areas, where WIL doesn't traditionally sit, but it might be that that's just different forms of WIL. So, we're giving them lots of options to do projects and consulting and incubators and global experiences, rather than embedding work-based WIL necessarily and ensuring students have an opportunity to do that. So, I haven't presented data on the other forms of WIL. I thought we'd keep key focus here on work-based WIL. So that's at the undergraduate level. Sorry, I'm just going to go back. Yeah. So key takeaways here in terms of participation WIL at a course level, and also in terms of the elective disciplines only. So you can see there's been a slight growth in work-based WIL for coursework graduates, but more so for HDRs, which is positive, and we're likely to see that grow further over the years. Consistent growth in non-workplace WIL across all course levels, which is fantastic. We've got that decline in global WIL, although there was a growth for HDRs. And again, that might be related possibly to COVID-19 and travel restrictions. And we've got more students engaging in any type of WIL across the course levels. But again, there is, flagging there's room for growth there, particularly among the postgraduate students where participation is relatively lower. And we can also say that there is considerable variation in participation in work-based WIL across what I've classed as elective discipline areas. So, some are doing well and there's growth, some are doing quite well, but it's falling. So again, this is really highlighting to look at your own institutional data and perhaps see where, what's happening across the 3-year period, and see, where there's particular areas where students are perhaps lacking an opportunity to engage in work-based WIL. So then shifting this focus instead to looking at variations in student participation in work-based WIL again, and work-based only by student group. So we have done webinars previously. We did one last year. In fact, it was with Bonnie on, and also Michelle Eady on looking at student participation in work-based WIL by the equity student groups. So we're narrowing down here to undergraduate level only. And what I've done is I've actually broken it down further to look at all the disciplines and then elective only, because I thought that might show perhaps there might be some patterns there for us to look at over the 3-year period. So just the left-hand side, that's all the different disciplines. So again, this is national data. You've got your 3 different years there. We're looking at undergraduates, international and domestic, participating in work-based WIL, and we're breaking it down by gender here. So blue being the males and orange being the females. You can see there that when we're looking across the disciplines, proportionately more females are participating in work-based WIL. And we can see that dip again in 2021 and then some recovery in 2022. So really, if we look across the 3-year period, there's not a great amount of change there over the 3-year period, and fairly consistent across the patterns, are fairly consistent across males and females. If we look at those elective disciplines only, again, for the females, you've got the slight dip and then you've got the recovery, although noting the recovery doesn't go back to the 2020 levels. And very similar pattern again for males. And I mean, just taking a step back, you can see if you look at those percentage figures on the right compared to the left, you can see that participation in work-based WIL across males and females is obviously proportionately less than across all the disciplines, because there's that mandatory element that we expect in those disciplines that are excluded. Looking then at socioeconomic status, which is classified in the GOS as low, medium, and high. So again, on the left-hand side, we've got a picture here that shows some, positive results, and because the literature does note that often low SES students tend to not, or there can be barriers to them for participating in work-based WIL, such as the logistics around travel, being able to, or losing paid employment, clothing, caring commitments, etc. So they perhaps don't participate as much. Now, your blue bar is your low SES students, and you can see what's happening over the years. There's been a growth there, which is great. And actually, they tend to participate proportionately more than high SES students, which is shown in grey. And we have reported on that previously in the other webinars, which is good to see. However, when we move it to the elective disciplines only, we are seeing a slightly different picture and what's actually in line with literature. And that's saying that proportionally less low SES students engage in work-based WIL, remembering this is at the undergraduate level, than their more privileged peers. So in terms of how that's changed over time, if we look at the lowest SES graduates, you've got that slight dip from 33 down to 31 and then up again. So it does recover, and it's pretty much static over the 2020 to 2022 period. I mean, slight growth there. And then if we look at the high SES, again, there's a dip, and again, it hasn't really recovered. Trying to be positive here, the gap is narrowing. If we look at those bars on the right-hand side of the elective graph, the gap is narrowing between the low SES and the high SES, which is good. And there is some growth there between 2020 and 2022. So I guess when we think about some of the initiatives that we've introduced to try to encourage students who, perhaps might need support to engage in work-based WIL, things like stipends, bursaries, matching service, because perhaps they're, into placements to help them source placements, because perhaps they're not as professionally networked than others. Hopefully, we're seeing that slight growth might be where, that support is helping. And I think it will be interesting to see how things progress further over the next year or two, to see if we can get that growth trajectory, bearing in mind that everything seemed to dip in 2021, which could possibly be related to lockdown restrictions. Again, it's hard to tell why there might be that dip there. So just moving on there to age, where there's some interesting, but I guess somewhat expected results. So if we look at all of the disciplines, we divide this up by 25 years to cut off. So above 25 is classes, 25 and above is classes mature age, and below not mature age or younger graduates. And if we look at their participation over the years, they're actually, over the 3-year period, they're fairly similar. There's some movement. If you look at the mature age, there's been some slight decline, and for the younger graduates, a slight rise. But, there's not a huge difference between the two groups. If we look, however, at just the elective disciplines, you can see a bit of a different story there. So you can see there's actually quite a big gap between the younger and the more mature graduates in terms of their participation in work-based WIL. And, this isn't a huge surprise to us. You might be thinking, okay, well, there could be some barriers for those more mature graduates to engage in placements. Again, it might be around caring commitments. It might be around they're already employed, so they're already working and other things. So it might be a lack of potential interest in doing a placement. If they're doing a degree to just possibly consolidate their qualifications, and they're quite happy with their current employment, for example, and they're not doing a degree for a career change or to support a new career pathway, then why would they want to participate in a placement, perhaps? So again, this, kind of flags the benefits of perhaps looking at your own institutional data and understanding your own course cohorts and seeing whether this is a question of lack of awareness, a lack of appreciation of the relevance and the quality of your work-based WIL offerings, or is it just simply reflective of their career stage? And again, only you, your institutions will know the answer to that when you look at the broader data. But essentially, you can see that proportion of mature age graduates doing WIL, students doing WIL, is declining over time in those elective areas. So something to definitely to consider. So looking at our students by whether they are Indigenous or they're not Indigenous. So again, looking at all disciplines, you can see that actually there's not a great deal of difference there between Indigenous students and their non-Indigenous peers. However, if we look at the elective only, we can see, again, there's some differences there. And the dip there between 2020 and 2021 for Indigenous students was quite sizable. Again, if we think about COVID, perhaps were they more impacted by COVID restrictions? I don't know. This is national data, but it's just something perhaps for us to think about. But thankfully, we can see that climb up there. We do know that Indigenous students can often be challenged for engaging in work-based WIL, and there's researchers that do write around this. We can see that climb, which is positive. But between 2020 and 2022, there has been a decline there in the elective disciplines, and they're still sitting as doing, proportionately less completing work-based WIL compared to non-Indigenous students. So again, that's something to watch for there. So looking at students with disability, and there has been a fair amount of discussion about the fact that students with disability are often disadvantaged in accessing WIL, or not necessarily disadvantaged, might have concerns about declaring their disability, and that might prevent them from engaging in work-based WIL. And also sometimes their experiences during WIL can be somewhat impacted by their concern with asking for adjustments and so forth. And I know there was the recent event on the ACEN event on this, which explored that further. Looking at all different disciplines, you can see that yes, students with disability participate proportionately less than those without disability. You can see, however, that there's a rise, although it went up in 2021 and kind of contravene that trend, that dip that we've been seeing more broadly, and then it dipped back down again. However, when we look at our elective only disciplines, you can see, that proportion, those proportions are quite low anyway. However, they are rising, which is a positive, and the gap does seem to be narrowing. When we look at the difference between the blue and the orange here, and then we look at it over in 2022, that's a positive news story in a way, but there's obviously more work to be done. And all of the work that's happening in this area, and hopefully resources that are being developed are obviously important and very timely. Moving on to citizenship, so comparing what's happening between domestic and international students. So again, if we look at all of the different disciplines here, we can see a growth in our international students participating in work-based WIL. So this is obviously undergrad level, which is great. They didn't experience that dip in 2021 that the domestic students did. If we look at what's happening in terms of the elective only areas, again, we're still seeing that growth and we're still seeing that narrowing of the gap, which is great. Could that be possibly all the work that's been going on in terms of promoting the strengths of international students to employers and trying to remove that reluctance, which has been reported previously by various different stakeholders on some employers not wishing to necessarily engage with international students as much as domestic due to concerns about cultural immersion and also communication. Possibly we're seeing that, the work in that area is having an impact, which is fantastic. And again, I'd encourage you to have a look at this at an institutional level. When we look at students or graduates that are from non-English speaking background, we can't see much difference across all of the different disciplines there. If we look at elective only, again, very little difference, which, again, is good. I mean, that means, again, potentially, could it be that the whole piece around communication, which we know has been, there has been some employers have reported back on communication, or it can be a struggle when they have students that are non-English speaking background or international students. English isn't their first language. It can be problematic. It can take longer for them to settle in. Hopefully we're seeing some improvements in that area. And lastly, the last kind of student group to look at is looking at the differences between regional and metro students. And I must apologise here, for some reason the group of interest is not the orange group. I've switched it around. That might be to just keep you on your toes or keep me on my toes. But either way, so we're looking at the blue bar here. So the difference is, this is all disciplines, is not particularly striking. Again, we see that dip for the metro students. We didn't really see such a dip in 2021. And it's very static across the 3 years for our regional students. However, slightly different story for the elective disciplines. You've got that fall over time for regional graduates, rising in for metro. So, and there is that the gap. Although it's not big, it seems to be widening. So there is a bit of concern there, or there perhaps should be some attention paid by institutions as to their offerings for regional students for work-based WIL. So some key takeaways there. Less males and females are participating in work-based WIL at the undergrad level. Low SES are participating proportionately less in work-based WIL in those elective areas, but the gap is lessening, which is good. The mature age, we've got those striking differences by age. Less are opting to participate in work-based WIL, and that gap is widening. We can see that there's declining participation in work-based WIL among Indigenous undergraduates, so that's something to keep our eye on. And proportionately less undergrads, those with disability, those where English is not their first language, and international students, although proportionately less are participating in work-based WIL, the gap with their counterpart group is lessening, which is good. And then just that last point from the last slide about the regional undergraduates, they are participating relatively less. That is declined, their participation is declining over time and the gap is widening. So that's really looking at the WIL side. And then just to spend a bit of time on the employability-related activities. Now, these are extra and co-curricular. So these aren't things that are embedded into courses. So those of you that are here from, careers areas, you might have more of an interest in this data. But, I know we do it in our own school. We do give access and we encourage students to participate in extracurricular activities and co-curricular activities that are facilitated centrally or by the school itself. So, even though this isn't necessarily embedded, this hopefully will be of interest to you as well. So just looking at participation by course level. So you've got your different ERAs along the bottom there. You've got 2020 in blue, 2021 in orange, and then you've got in grey, you've got the last year of data for 2022. Now, a few key points here. Volunteering, essentially, you can see, is the most popular form of ERA, followed by having a position of responsibility in a club or society, and then followed by mentoring. And that's actually, you'll see shortly, that's pretty much consistent across the different course levels. What we're also seeing is that there's been a fall in student participation in employability-related activities that sit outside of the curriculum over the 3 years. The only one that reported any growth at the undergrad level is your micro-credentialing or digital badge programs. But you can see on the far left, you've got all of those graduates that reported they didn't participate in any. You can see that that's rising, and that's obviously reflected in the fall in each of those individual different types there. So why might that be? You know, I mean, again, really nationally, it's quite hard to predict necessarily on what that might be. It might be because they're time poor. It might be because they're more in paid employment. It might be because, on a positive note, we're putting more things into the curriculum. There could be a whole raft of different reasons there. And again, I'd encourage you to look at your own institution data to get a better feel for what might be happening there. Postgrad level, slightly different story. I mean, same in the sense that volunteering, followed by the position of responsibility, followed by mentoring, are the most popular. We've also got that growth in micro-credentialing, and we've also got the fall in those generally in the other areas, although actually mentoring was a bit more static, as were co-curricular, leadership program, and also the incubator. So there has been a fall generally, but it's less. It's not as significant as at an undergrad level. And I guess taking another step back, we can see that less postgraduates tend to participate in those activities anyway than at than undergrad coursework level. HGRs, so slightly different here again. You can see consistency in terms of the popularity of those 3 different types. But in terms of participation in any, the bars on the far right, you can see that actually rather than falling, which we saw for the coursework graduates, we're seeing that dip slightly and it's come up again. So it's fairly static over time, but at least it's not falling. But this thing about at least it's not falling, we don't know that the fall in participating in co or extracurricular activities is necessarily a negative. If it is that we're putting more things into the curriculum, then we might actually frame that in a positive way. It really just depends on what's happening with our own institution and what's happening with our own courses. And lastly, just to look briefly at participation in the different ERAs by student group. So I didn't want to break this down for all of the different ERAs. I just done it for a couple. And you've got volunteering there. So just to flag how to read this chart. So you've got the blue is, we take each of the different groups. So running across, obviously, we start with the left, we've got gender. The blue is the earliest year, 2020, above is 2021, and above that is 2022. So yes, we can look at the change over time, but I think, it was pretty clear in the previous slides that participation, this is undergraduates, is falling. So we probably expect for the participation to fall for each of those individual groups over the 3-year period. So it might just be easier and quicker to just concentrate on these grey bars here at the top and see if you can see any differences between the 2 different groups here. So for gender, I mean, you can see that females participate proportionately more or in volunteering than males. And even though that's declining over time, if you look at the difference here, 49.8 to 41.2, we know that participation generally is falling. In terms of your low SES and looking at high SES, so high SES graduates reported that they participated more. That's consistent with literature. We know that in terms of co and extracurricular activities, low SES students, sometimes it's more difficult for them to engage because, for them to do that, they're unable to participate in other things, whether that's paid employment or looking after, caring commitments and so forth. So that does kind of align with what we might expect. Also aligning with what we would probably expect are the differences by age. You can see that our more mature graduates participate quite a lot, a lot less than their younger counterparts, which, we might imagine it might be due to commitments and, financial pressures, or it might be because they feel that they don't need to participate in those things to increase their employability. When we look at our Indigenous students, yes, they're participating proportionately less than non-Indigenous students. And this has fallen over time, but not as acutely as other groups. In terms of students with disability, interestingly, so students with disability participate proportionately more, or they volunteer proportionately more than the students without disability. International students pretty much on a par between domestic and international, and the same for whether they're for NESB graduates as well. And actually a very similar story. Sorry, it's also reversed around here for the regional students, very similar to metro students as well. First and family, we're seeing quite a big difference there. We're seeing that those first and family are participating proportionately less actually than other groups, but also than those whose parents were university educated. And again, there's quite a lot of literature around that, although possibly it's easier to look at this SES breakdown, because first and family is a very diverse group of students. You've got, there's a lot of intersectionality there, whether they might span into other different equity groups as well. So perhaps quite difficult to interpret that. I did this also, and it's the only other one that I did it for, is for position of responsibility in a club or society. And I guess I did this just to highlight that the differences in the groups actually depend on the activity. Because some of the results are quite different here for volunteering to this particular one. So, for example, females, while they tended to volunteer more than males, they tend to they're less likely to hold a position of responsibility than males, and that hasn't reduced that much over time. And the same here, you can see for both groups. In terms of, we've got the same messaging here for SES. You've got high SES students participating proportionately more, and actually by quite a sizable amount, than our low SES students. That has declined over time for both groups. Mature age, again, same message. They participate proportionately less, and again, it's a big difference than the younger graduates. Indigenous graduates reported that they participated proportionately less in these types of activities. Students with disability more. So again, that aligns with volunteering as well. We've got a bit more disparity here for our international students. For volunteering, they were fairly equal with domestic students, graduates, but here they actually seem to be more engaged in positions of responsibility in clubs and societies. Non-English speaking graduates pretty much on a par. And then you've got your regional graduates here, flipped over, they're featuring on the left, and they seem to participate more. But again, that's declining over time. And first and family, again, you've got that big difference there. But again, just, highlighting that group can be somewhat harder to interpret. So that just gives you a bit of a sense, I guess, on some national patterns, but also on what you could do with your own data. Now, this one is looking at the proportion. This is the final chart that looks at no participation at all in employability-related activities. Again, remember, this is just undergrads. So again, we might take this as a negative, that they're not participating in all of those things that we might lay on, or that they might organise themselves. We also might take it as a positive in that, okay, no, we're embedding all of those things. So they don't need to engage in all of those things, perhaps. There's two different viewpoints, but saying that, we do spend a fair amount of time investing and designing in all of these activities, and we do know that they can support the development of employability. So a fall in participation is, some might think is not a positive thing. So we can see here that, less females don't participate than males. Low SES, we know that more low SES students, they don't engage in these activities. And again, that would align with literature. Same with the more mature graduates, they don't participate as much, or they're more likely to not participate than younger graduates. Indigenous graduates reported that they participate less, so they, more of them don't engage in ERAs at all. Students with disability, this we would expect because of the earlier charts. So they're actually, there's fewer students with disability that are not participating at all in ERAs. International students, there are fewer international students that are not participating at all compared to domestic. There's proportionally slightly NESB, regional and metro, not much difference there. And I guess, again, first and family, we would expect that given the earlier slides. So key takeaways, and I'll just move you to a few key implications, and then we'll go to questions. So volunteering is the most popular form, followed by that position of responsibility in a couples society, and then mentoring. We've got declining participation in ERAs over time for coursework graduates. That's both, particularly at the bachelor level. There are nuances in participation among those groups by activity type. It's a bit difficult to make any kind of sweeping statements on that, although you can see some of the nuances there in those two earlier slides. And the groups of interest that are participating generally less in ERAs are those of low socioeconomic status, mature age, Indigenous and first and family groups. So final slide, implications for practitioners and policy. So I guess just taking, and again, this is national data, so, this needs to be looked at the institutional level, but there is room to grow work-based WIL, particularly in postgrad courses. There's clearly an opportunity to rebuild global WIL in undergraduate and postgraduate courses. We saw that declining over time. Would recommend some granular analysis, as has been saying, throughout the discipline or course level, because there is variation in those different fields, and you might break your elective disciplines down differently. There might be some of those ones that I showed, you might know that they mandate work-based WIL. There's also scope to review promotion processes and practice of work-based WIL for certain groups to try to encourage them to participate. As well, I need to continue to find ways to minimise barriers for certain student groups participating in work-based WIL, and in particular those groups that are mentioned there. So that's it in terms of the review. Just to clarify that the webinar obviously is being recorded, and while the slides won't be posted, the webinar will be available on the website. And also just to highlight that we will be producing a brief, like a summary brief, with these charts, some of these charts and some commentary around it. We're hoping that will be released in the next probably month or so, I would imagine. It might be that we wait for the impact one in June and then release the two together. That's it from me. That's enough talking for a moment, and over to you, Bonnie.
Thank you so much, Denise, for such a comprehensive overview. There's a lot to capture there over 3 years. My key takeaways as you were presenting then was specifically around how we support equity groups. It's actually quite comforting to know that the gap is narrowing, particularly those for students with disability and those from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And yet there is still so much more that we can do. But perhaps it is a sign that some initiatives and strategies are working. So that's also quite a positive news story for us to take away. Denise, what I'll get you to do is to start at the top of the chat. We do have some questions that are posted in the chat. So what I'll get you to do is to start at the top, and let's see if we can work our way through.
Yeah, happy to go on from there, Bonnie. And if I'm running out of time, just shout if I'm not going to make it through. So Alana's question, and it's an interesting one, Alana. We had to come up with a way of classifying WIL, which I think if all WIL practitioners will know is close to impossible. We went for the 3 different types, and whether it's virtual or face-to-face. So we didn't specify about mode there. So when they're thinking work-based WIL, internship, but they might have done some of it, hybrid, it would fall under work-based WIL. But at the end of the day, this is really how the graduate completed that survey. And that really points to the fact that we desperately need sector-wide measures that classify WIL. And so we won't have to necessarily rely on these data for classifying and for students reporting on their own participation in WIL, but actually we'll be reporting it at a sector level. But that's a separate topic. Wayne, is this more to do with the lag effect of COVID and the shift to non-workplace? So I presume you're talking about the growth there, Wayne, over non-workplace. And yes, as we've flagged, there's that dip for work-based will in 2021, but in a lot of instances it rose again. So I don't know that we're seeing a case of non-workplace will taking over work-based will. I think it's more that we're offering more options for our students. So you've got that small growth in work-based will, and you've got growth in non-workplace will as well. So I just think it's about actually more offerings, I would suspect. But I do think that COVID features in there for that 2021 data. Stephanie, how were students who don't identify as male or female represented in the data collection? Okay, so the Social Research Centre report back on gender. So I need to refer back to that and go through that. But if there were any other groups that were reported on, they would have been presented today if that data had fallen into any other groups. So that's, I'm not exactly, I honestly can't recall at this point how the data that we're provided with, how that classifies or how they go through that process of classifying. So I'd need to refer back to that. If you'd like to drop me an email separately, Stephanie, I'm very happy to answer that question for you. Is there any push to the department to include will questions as standard? Yes. Okay, it's a big fat yes there, Sharon. So as we just mentioned, if we had, well, no, actually, if we had, there's two different approaches to this. You can either put these questions in as a standard, but to the GOS. But to be honest, most institutions are doing these questions anyway. You're still relying on graduates to report back on whether they participated in WIL. And as we know, they might get confused on which type of WIL. Oh, was I in the workplace, but I did it a bit hybrid, rah. So you've got a few issues there. What would be better is that institutions across the sector have some guidance on ways that we collect data on our student participation in different forms of WIL. That's reported. We can actually then create a variable. The Social Research Centre can create a variable around the different types of WIL that they participated in into the actual GOS itself. Just as they do, they pull on data for, gender, age, and so forth. So it actually, to me, the onus is on us to create, and that's why we're creating the community of practice for success measures in WIL. If we can get some standardized measures across the sector, we can actually have yes, I did, or no, I didn't, automatically placed in the GOS, and then much easier. We're not relying on graduates to report back on what might be classed as subjective measures. Laura, I had a recent email from Quilt saying that only 11 institutions across Australia have the ACEN GOS embedded in the note. That's not the case. We have 34. So, Laura, if you want to share that email with me and we can clarify, but there's definitely 34 actually out of field at the moment. And no, yes, absolutely. It's always been optional for our members to participate in this, and it's always been free and it remains free. Okay, I'm going to leave questions around methodology. If you've got any particular questions around that, then just drop me an email around that separately. So just to clarify, QUILT is the suite of surveys. The Social Research Centre are the body, and we work very closely with them, who actually administer the GOS, and they administer our ACEN items as well. Okay, so ERAs, Rebecca, employability-related activities. So we look at, I think it's 6 from memory, and that's what that data were around. And the ERAs sit as extra or co-curricular offerings. It's very obvious to the students or the graduates answering the survey that they are not for academic credit. They're not part of their formal curriculum. So that's what that means. Okay.
That brings us to the end of the questions. We have no more questions for you at this point.
Yeah.
I want to just take a moment though, Denise, to ask you if you have any final reflections as you look at this massive presentation. What was the thing that stood out for you the most? Okay, I think I was hoping, honestly, to see more work-based WIL. I was hoping to see a bigger growth across the elective disciplines. I found breaking the elective group out really quite insightful, but I was a bit disappointed that we didn't see more growth there. That's one. I found the
growth in non-workplace will heartening. And I think it's fantastic, especially as the work that you and I did, Bonnie, on analysing the data and showing the benefits of that for students' collaborative skills and other things. So I think that was great. And I do think that I guess another key point is the nuances by student group. You can see the nuances there when you look at it, elective or all disciplines. So I really think that breaking this down to a discipline level, which is our next step, actually, ACEN's next step is to actually look at this nationally at discipline level, but also looking at an institutional level is really important. And a final one was the fall in the participation in employability-related activities outside the curriculum, which was quite striking over the 3-year period. I do wonder why that is. And I because, I don't know if it's the same in your institution. I suspect it is. We put a lot of energy and time into developing and facilitating these different activities that aren't a formal part of the curriculum. And I think I can say that many of us feel the pain of students often not engaging in those things, which can be very tricky if you've got industry that have made the effort and time to be there. And, that data kind of affirmed that numbers are falling there. And even though we've got this big drive of employability, which you might think, now we push into the curriculum, and that's great as long as we are embedding those things into the curriculum. If there's drop off and it's not being picked up in the curriculum, then it's a bit of a concern.
Yeah,
those are my key takeaways. Sorry.
Thank you. One thing I'm also curious about, Denise, is whether or not we're going to see any impacts from NPIL strategies that started last year. I'm curious to see as data emerges, particularly from, say, 2023, 2024, so graduates who are 6 months post-graduation, whether or not there are institutional strategies that have been introduced during last year in 2022 to 2024 because of NPILs. Not sure if we can ever make a direct correlation to that, obviously, but curious to see if there is going to be more uptake in work-based WIL and non-work-based WIL, and perhaps we could surmise this could be because of a governmental priority of WIL.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And I think certainly in the HDR space where there seems to be NPIL measures around that, and we've already seen that growth, which was fantastic to see. And we've had obviously some great insights via ACEN and other forums on the type of work that people are doing in this area. I think that will be interesting to see how that changes. And I guess if the government does produce some kind of summary document where we can see the spread of the different NPIL measures and we can correlate that somehow to any changes in our data, that would be that, because we will know who's participating in ours and whose NPIL measures were what, then that could be quite interesting. But again, I'd say at an institutional level, then that if you can see what happens with your GOS data, your ACEN GOS data, and what your NPIL measures are, and see those changes as well, you could get some tidy findings and some key messages for your institution around that too.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Denise, I want to say a heartfelt thank you to you for preparing this presentation for us today, for taking the time to analyse such a massive data set over the past 3 years. If you enjoyed today's webinar and you'd like to find out more, we actually do have another GOS webinar coming up on the 8th of June. While this one looked at student participation in WIL, the next webinar that Denise will be delivering for us is about the impact of WIL on graduate outcomes. So please stick around on the 8th of June and join us for that GOS webinar. I've put the link there in the chat. Denise, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you to all of you for joining us. Bye, everybody.
See ya. Bye, everyone.